Hello, and welcome to Historicus Navalis, the history channel specialized on the lives and fates of individual ships and seafarers, maritime myths and mysteries, and untold stories of the past. In the second documentary of our series about underdocumented historic ships and incidents, we'd like to reveal some less-known aspects involving a very special cargo ship that foundered in a cyclone in the North Atlantic in December 1978. Since there were no survivors, no report exists about the actual course of events that led to her sinking. Much to the regret of seafarers, a lot of cock-and-bull stories and frenzied speculations have been disseminated over the years. Some of them are even being repeated against better knowledge until today.
The following narrative is a screen adaptation of an article written by Captain Peter Heimstadt on occasion of the 30th anniversary of the tragedy in December 2008 that was published in the renowned German maritime magazine Schiff und Hafen, in English, Ship and Seaport. All conjectures made therein are based on a firm knowledge of structural designs of large cargo vessels, as well as long-term practical experience with ship handling in heavy weather. The piece evoked an enormous response from seafarers and other marine professionals all over the world, and due to the positive feedback it received, the article stands out against the numerous wise guy wannabes who still don't restrain themselves and even dare to create absurd conspiracy theories. The author of the said article narrowly escaped the company's order to embark on that disastrous voyage, and as fate would have it, his schoolmate went on board instead. Everyone who has a least feeling of empathy may understand what it meant to be allowed through the will of God to live on due to the ultimate sacrifice of a close friend. Hence, our documentary also serves as a memento of human vulnerability and a warning to all those who blindly believe in the invincibility of technological progress. If you enjoyed this glimpse behind the scenes of one of the greatest mysteries of seafaring, please don't hesitate to give us a like. More videos of underdocumented ships, their crews, and historical ventures will follow on this channel. Thank you. On the 15th of December 2007, widely ignored by the public, the LASH carrier Rhine Forest of the Holland America Line called the port of Rotterdam for the last time in her long life. By reason of a constant decline of her utilization in the transatlantic liner trade, the former Bilderdick, sister ship of the München, had been sold to Bangladesh and scrapped there on the dirty beaches. Towards the end of the 1960s, there was a series of plausible arguments to establish a worldwide sea transport system which could be operated independently from customary seaport infrastructure. A mothership fitted with a special gantry crane loaded standardized floatable cargo containers, so-called lighters, on board and carried them to their port of destination where they were discharged in reverse order. Once again afloat, these lighters were then coupled together and distributed to individual points of the country's inland waterway system. The idea was definitely ingenious. However, from the economical point of view, global containerization proved to be more efficient, and eventually the LASH concept was driven out of the market, even on the North Atlantic, where it was able to stand its ground for more than 4 decades besides container lines. The building costs of those highly specialized motherships, as well as investments in the large number of lighters which had to be made available along the entire supply chain, were strikingly high, too high to be competitive in the end.
At about the same time, the third generation of large container vessels had been introduced. Those turbine-driven ships could take 3,000 TEU on board and steamed with no less than 28 knots in the so-called Trio service to East Asia, and within 64 days back to Europe. But seaports in Europe and the Far East were badly prepared for these first mega-boxers. And hence, even the modern port of Singapore still needed 30 to 36 hours to handle just 1,500 container moves. This, in fact, seemed to be an ideal domain for the innovative lighter concept. Unfortunately, the LASH system appeared not suitable for the Asian trading pattern because it required navigable rivers and well-developed canals to and from seaports, and, in addition, sufficient tugs available for towing the lighters. China, with its huge inland waterways, was indeed best suited for the LASH concept, but Beijing, with help from the World Bank, invested in the development of their large container ports. Similar applied to Thailand. Vietnam was still shattered by the war, and the later so-called Tiger States had not yet emerged. So, every effort focused upon a global containerization. Inevitably, the München and her sister ship were restricted to merely serving northwest European continental ports on one side, and the various river estuaries of the American South States on the other side of the Atlantic. Hence, both vessels were condemned to live in the shadow, and consequently, the München remained the first and only LASH carrier that ever had been flying the German flag. Nevertheless, she was definitely another example of Hanseatic entrepreneurship strictly in accordance with the traditional motto, Buten und Binnen, Wagen und Winnen, which roughly translates as, globally and locally, take chances and earn. MS München was built on the Hoboken shipyard in Antwerp, Belgium. And I wish you and your crew always fair winds, following seas, and a safe return home. These words were used on the 12th of May, 1972, by the ship's godmother, Mrs. Anneliese Sheeran, when she christened the ship solemnly before she was launched into the water. Already on her maiden voyage, expectations of owners were completely fulfilled. The Combi Line, a joint venture of Hapag-Lloyd and Holland America Line, operated the ship in the North Atlantic liner trade. A typical port rotation between Northwest Europe and U.S. Gulf ports included regular calls at Bremerhaven, Rotterdam, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, and Houston. On this route, the München frequently demonstrated a remarkable performance. Her flexibility and quick turnaround times in port were far superior over container vessels operating in the same trade.
The München made 61 voyages across the Atlantic, and very soon she became an object of interest of the maritime scenery in northern Europe and along the American east and south coast. As usual, the North Atlantic with its frequent storm fronts was crossed on the shortest route. That, of course, required a deeper understanding of meteorological aspects as well as good nautical skills and experience. Hapag-Lloyd's ship captains have always been attested good knowledge of seamanship practice. They were well aware of the irks and quirks of that tricky sea area. These included reports about extreme heavy seas as they are often encountered between Cape Hatteras and the Bay of Biscay. Even from a meteorological standpoint, the transatlantic passage on a Great Circle route is mostly the shortest, if not the safest option. Nonetheless, some captains preferred to use a wide roundabout route via the Azores Islands since they felt much more comfortable down there. It corresponds with a rule of thumb that the weather on a southerly track during the summer season appears to be more quiet, but that applies only to the summer season. Unfortunately, long-term experience has shown that circumstances look different between September and January. On top of that, a loxodrome or rumb line route does not only imply a greater distance to travel, but also a higher probability of being forced to reduce speed in heavy seas. The greatest disadvantage of a southerly route, however, is the uncalculable risk of large roll amplitudes, particularly towards the end of the year. Due to the predominant easterly to northeasterly tracks of tropical revolving storms, TRS, vessels on such course inevitably steer into the hazardous path of the storm. With the aim to sneak past the storm on a southerly course in order to keep a wide berth from the storm center, which is according to the first Schubarth rule, there is an imminent risk to stumble into the most dangerous and powerful quadrant of the storm field. This so-called dangerous sector is on the top right of the storm path, and this is where the action takes place. The strongest winds, the heaviest torrential rains, and the highest waves of a cyclonic storm lie in the first quadrant. Concurrently, it doesn't matter whether the eye of the storm has moved further eastward or not. Even though the storm has become stationary, and in the meantime the ship was able to move ahead to the south, the overall situation remains the same. With winds veering and waves surging from the port beam, the ship's roll amplitudes increase to a perilous spike, and her movements become dangerous. If the roll period coincides with a wave crest passing the vessel's righting lever is reduced, and consequently this leads to even larger roll angles. This roll amplification is called parametric rolling or parametric resonance, and can cause the ship to roll heavily even in moderate seas, leading to cargo damage, loss of deck cargo, and, in the worst case, capsizing of the ship. As we know today, particularly large container vessels with wide bow and stern flares are susceptible to extreme roll motion. Examples of the past are incidents which affected the container ships APL China in 1998, the OOCL America 2 years later, and the Chicago Express in 2008, the latter even sustained the casualty of one of her crew. As far as could be done in winter season, those dynamic low-pressure areas were given a wide berth. Fully aware that ocean-going vessels move in a complex geophysical environment, Hapag-Lloyd had always set great value upon applied meteorological navigation. As one of their prime duties, the nautical officers were required to receive weather reports and charts and transmit formatted weather observations (OBS) to the respective Marine Weather Service ashore. Almost every ship of the fleet was equipped with a weather chart facsimile. Each watchkeeping officer was well versed with proper interpretation and evaluation of actual weather charts. Furthermore, it was and still is customary practice to participate with the automatic sea rescue system of the U.S. Coast Guard. It was just in September 1978 that the master of the München, Captain Johann Danekamp, had been awarded the Golden Amver Pennant. The Automated Mutual Vessel Rescue System, shortly AMVER, had been introduced in 1958, and ever since it has proven itself as an effective ship, locating and coordination service for oceanic sea rescue. Participation is voluntary. By regular position reports, the course and speed of each registered ship are plotted, so its actual position may be determined, and a search and rescue operation can be launched any time without delay. Today, over 22,000 ships participate in AMVER. An average of 4,000 ships are on the AMVER plot each day, and those numbers continue to increase. The AMVER Center computer receives over 14,000 AMVER messages a day. Over 2,800 lives have been saved by AMVER participating ships since 2000.
Since November 1978, North Atlantic weather conditions were gridlocked. A steadily deepening extratropical cyclone about 600 nautical miles north of the Azores Islands came to a slowdown, and around 8th December, the storm center became quasi-stationary. During the previous weeks, this storm was preceded by a series of smaller low-pressure areas, which already created an extremely high and steep sea state. There was a repeated buildup of violent cyclonic vortices, whose offshoots reached out far into Central Europe. These low-pressure troughs were running against continuously increasing high-pressure areas over North and Northeast Europe. On the 8th and 9th December, one of these storm fronts approached from the southwest and swept over Central Europe, causing chaotic situations through ice and snow precipitation. The official weather chart of December 8th shows the conditions with a huge low in the Atlantic and a high-pressure area in the northeast. The following day, the center of the high-pressure area evaded then towards the Black Sea. Nevertheless, during the weeks which followed, very high pressure remained over northeast Germany, and Atlantic troughs got stuck over the Baltic Sea in a so-called graveyard of fronts. Under these adverse conditions, A northerly route certainly had been the only option. Regretfully, we shall never learn why Captain Dienekamp chose a loxodromic course, namely 253 degrees, to their port of destination, Savannah. However, after evaluation of the ship's last position report and thorough reconstruction of the position of her sinking, it is quite obvious that 12 to 24 hours before his ship went into distress, he must have changed her course to the south. He made this decision because apparently he had come to the conclusion that it would be inevitable to steer into the dangerous sector if he had stuck to the westerly course. At that time, it was too late to venture a crossing of the storm path in order to reach the navigable sector of the cyclone. On December 11th, his ship had already come abeam of the storm center. Captain Dienekamp turned to the south and therefore effectively reduced the uncomfortable heavy roll motion of the ship. But this positive aspect had been paid dearly for even more violent pitching and pounding motions. In order to sail away from the dangerous forward right sector of the storm, the captain had no other choice but to take the sea from the head. By this, the ship's hull structure had to absorb extremely heavy punches, perhaps even disruptive slamming hits. Slamming is defined as the striking of the sea surface by a ship's forward flat bottom, when the vessel is pitching in a head sea, raising her bow completely out of the water, then pounding with high kinetic energy onto the sea surface. This may cause severe tremors and damage to the ship's bottom structure, and therefore must be avoided under all circumstances.
Then, in the early morning of December 12, 1978, precisely at 10 minutes past the hour of 3 Greenwich Mean Time, the Greek bulk carrier Marion received the distress message of MV München, and the tragedy began. We may suppose that Captain Dienekamp had paid close attention to the progress of weather conditions ever since the ship had embarked on her voyage. Furthermore, it is recognized that the captain had exercised due diligence when he weighed the risk of a southerly circumvention against a classic Great Circle route. Like many others in a similar situation, he had most likely anticipated that the cyclone would keep moving on its typical path in east-northeasterly direction, and the ship might reach the more quiet backside of the storm very soon. In fact, if he had been able to advance southward closer to the Azores Islands until December 14th, he could have indeed expected steadily decreasing wind forces and calmer seas. Like I said, these might have been the captain's reflections. In any case, it is remarkable that the München sought a southwesterly course from the very beginning of her Atlantic crossing, outbound from the English Channel. This is even more noteworthy as such daring voyage plan, particularly in December, has been controversial among old salts since long. In the 1952 German sailing directions of the Atlantic Ocean, we read, for example, quote, "The route from the Pentland Firth to Cape Race is the shortest of all going from Europe to North America. The best season for this route is between September and January. In the past, even vessels with less propulsion power made pretty fast voyages on the northern route to North American ports. In seasons with only slight drift ice, the months of July till December are considered most favorable for such passages across the Atlantic. This period embraces the summer months with their less storm frequency, which is, however, increasing in autumn, but do not reach its maximum intensity by December." Unquote. Moreover, in the German Maritime Weather Journal, Seaward Captain Lemke had reported the following in 1934. Quote, "For steamers with less propulsion power, the northern route around Scotland is considerably shorter than the proposed ways on the southerly route to the United States. When weighing all pros and cons of both routes against each other, the northern option will be often given preference, which significantly shortens travel time. In those many years in which I crossed the Atlantic during all seasons, I truly observed quite dreadful, long-lasting westerly storms on the southern route." Unquote. These experience reports were admittedly no longer the newest. However, according to Professor Dr. Mertens, the then president of the German Maritime Meteorological Agency, it was still considered valid and up to date. Professor Mertens made a trenchant commentary on an inappropriate article published by the German tabloid newspaper Stern about the München sinking. He wrote, quote, "In that article, it is argued that the Hamburg-based meteorologists had allegedly recommended the ship's command to circumnavigate the cyclone on a southerly route. It is further claimed in that article that in spite of this advice, the München had continued to stay on her shorter path. This exposition is wrong. First of all, it should be noted that the München had never received a weather routing advice because her captain did not request any such service. Second, in case he had actually asked for a routing service, the captain never would have been advised to circumnavigate the low-pressure area on a southerly course, as such recommendation had been factually wrong." Unquote. So, in addition to the inexplicable reasons why the captain set out across the Atlantic on a rumbline track, he did not request a weather routing advice from the Maritime Weather Service. Even though it was, and still is, not compulsory to follow such recommendation, it would have given rise to thoughts about other options, and the captain might have changed his voyage plan. As if that weren't enough, no any deviation report was sent to AMVER. Since December 9th, no further position report, and no update of the ship's course and speed had been received by AMVER. Given the professional experience and unblemished reputation of the captain, human failure may certainly be ruled out as possible explanations of these shortcomings. There are no records about Captain Dennekamp which would attest him negligent or complacent attitudes while in command of his ships in the past. During the search and rescue operation that followed, weak radio signal strength and garbled message contents were experienced by all parties, which allows the presumption that something could have been wrong with the ship's radio equipment. After all, it can be said that lack of position, course, and speed data constitute the main reason why the search for the München, despite its historic dimension, was condemned to failure.
The München departed Bremerhaven on December 7th at 5:40 a.m. The ship was fully laden with 83 barges, and her port of destination was Savannah on the American southeast coast. In accordance with the voyage plan prepared by the navigation officer Reinhard Pöpke and approved by Captain Dennekamp, the course was set for the English Channel. 2 days later, they passed Land's End, the most westerly point of mainland England, on the starboard beam, and set out into the Atlantic Ocean. 7 minutes past the hour of midnight GMT, on December 12th, Heinz Lohmann, the radio officer of the German cruise ship Caribe, had a so-called QSO, a voice radio exchange on a common chat frequency, with his colleague Jörg Ernst on board of the München. The radio officer of the München mentioned heavy weather and even some damages to the ship's navigation bridge, but his voice was calm and he didn't seem concerned. Heinz Lohmann later reported that the quality of communication was partly bad. Before he terminated their chat, the München's last noon position was given by 44 degrees north and 24 degrees west. 3 hours later, at 03:10 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the Greek bulk carrier Marion received the distress message of the München, along with her position, which was given by 46 degrees 15 minutes north and 27 degrees 30 minutes west. The Marion immediately relayed the SOS message, but it was not before 3:40 a.m. that the first coastal radio station, namely Arcachon in southwestern France, responded and further disseminated it. At 5 o'clock, the information reached the Hapag-Lloyd head office in Hamburg, where a crisis management group was formed at once. At 7:30 a.m., coordination of the search and rescue operation was handed over to the MRSC Maritime Rescue Subcenter Land's End in the United Kingdom. Almost the same time, at 7:38 a.m., the first maritime patrol aircraft, a British Nimrod, started at Royal Air Force Base Kinloss in Scotland to search for the München. Meanwhile, prevailing westerly winds had reached strengths of Beaufort 11 to 12, with frequent gusts of up to 75 knots. Around 3:30 p.m., the master of the Dutch ocean-going salvage tug Smit Rotterdam, Captain Peter Denies, took over the task of search and rescue coordination directly in the search area defined by the MRSC. With daybreak on December 13th, 3 aircraft and 6 ships were involved in searching. Winds in the search area were howling from west-northwest with force Beaufort 11. General visibility was reported of only 2 to 4 nautical miles. Between 5 and 7:14 p.m., the U.S. military base at Rota in southern Spain received München's weak Mayday calls at regular intervals. Search efforts remained unsuccessful. On December 14th, for the first time, aircraft from the German Navy were taking part in the search. During the day, a total of 4 aircraft and 17 ships were dispersed in the search area. The wind force had slightly decreased to Beaufort 9, but still blowing from west-northwest. Signals from a distress buoy were heard by all ships.
In the afternoon of December 14th, a German maritime patrol aircraft, a Breguet Atlantic of the German Naval Air Wing 3 at Nordholz near Cuxhaven, discovered the first material trace of the München, 2 gray barges floating in the water, around 50 nautical miles south of the position stated in the distress message. They must have drifted there from the position where the München sank. In the following days, another lighter was spotted by aircraft, and both were later towed to Lisbon. As it could be determined from the loading list, the lighters were stowed in the aft part of the ship. Since the search for the München, and particularly for survivors, was a race against time, the German Navy rapidly deployed more and more aircraft. On the second day of the search, the Navy's own maritime patrol aircraft, shortly MPA, were assisted by aircraft of the German Luftwaffe. The Air Transport Wings 61 and 63 at Wunstorf sent 2 C-160 Transall aircraft. They ensured an uninterrupted supply of required material and transport of personnel. The U.S. Air Base. Lajes on the Azores Islands served as operating base. On the third day of the search, a nautical superintendent of Hapag-Lloyd joined the crew of 1 German MPA, and since he brought along a number of handheld VHF radio devices, also known as walkie-talkies, the aircraft could effectively communicate with merchant vessels involved in the search. The enormous search effort with British, German, American, and Portuguese aircraft, as well as more and more merchant ships, led to the discovery of some flotsam, but no trace of any survivors. However, on the 6th day of the search, a painful surprise came out of the blue after one of the German aircraft had discovered the München's distress radio beacon, shortly EPIRB. It floated up automatically when the ship sank and had been transmitting continuously for days without having been located. It turned out that the beacon had started transmitting at 11 a.m. GMT on December 13th. In other words, the München must have been afloat for at least 32 hours after her distress call on December 12th at 0310 GMT. Also recovered were the 2 life buoys, 2 life jackets, and 4 of the 6 life rafts, one of which was heavily smeared with oil. About 11 weeks after the sinking, actually in March 1979, a cargo ship eventually recovered the starboard lifeboat. It was unused, heavily damaged, and found adrift, vertically floating in the water. However, there was no trace of the 28 people on board of the München. Meanwhile, the search conducted by merchant ships had gathered speed. Already since December 12th at 3:30 p.m., the Dutch salvage tug Smit Rotterdam coordinated the search of 5 merchant vessels, namely the Buntentor, the Dart Europe, the German salvage tug Titan, the Hector, and the Camilla. In the night, at 10:15 p.m., these ships had taken their starting positions and commenced searching while trying to maintain a parallel course of 100 degrees in high and heavy swell from astern. What made things even more difficult was that most of the ships involved in the search could only sail in easterly direction, namely in the stern quarter sea. Turning back on an opposite course upon reaching the eastern limit of the designated search area would have meant fighting against the heavy seas, and that was extremely risky. Hence, it was impossible to carry out the search and rescue operation by the book that required to follow specific search patterns. By the time morning had broken of December 18th, the 7th search day, the number of search and rescue units had increased to 13 aircraft and 31 ships. Only then had it become known that the radio operator of the München had mentioned the ship's noon position of the previous day in the chat with his colleague on the German cruise liner Caribe just 3 hours before the SOS signal was sent. As it was quickly determined, that position had been around 100 nautical miles south-southeast of the transmitted distress position. It has since been widely believed that the SOS position was incorrect and the search was started in the wrong place. We will go into this in more detail later.
Primary contact point of the sea and sea air operations during the search was the ARCC, Aeronautical Rescue Coordination Center of the Royal Air Force in Plymouth. There, all relevant information gathered by the on-scene coordinator, Smit Rotterdam, and the MRSC Land's End were converged and forwarded to the Royal Air Force Base Kinloss, the operations department of the German Navy in Glucksburg, the Portuguese Navy, and the U.S. Air Base Lajes in the Azores. Already on the fifth day, the ARCC Plymouth wanted to cease all search efforts, as there was no longer any prospect of finding survivors. On top of that, almost every frontline member of the search, including the crisis management teams on land, had got tired and exhausted. But the head of Hapag-Lloyd's nautical department, Captain Olaf von Madel, was far from giving up. And so the lines between Hamburg, Bonn, London, Plymouth, and Glucksburg were running hot. The German Ministry of Transport even instructed the Navy's operations department to request all possible countries to provide more search resources. But after consulting the ministry, this demand was withdrawn. Finally, after the British Ministry of Transport had lobbied the MRSC Land's End and the ARCC Plymouth, it was agreed to terminate the search on the ninth day. Hapag-Lloyd also joined in, albeit with a heavy heart. However, while repatriation of all aircraft was being initiated, a press release from the German Ministry of Transport reached the Navy's Operations Center, stating that the federal government had urgently requested all domestic and foreign agencies to continue the search for survivors and to exhaust every last possible option in a follow-up operation. It was also announced that the German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt did not agree with the military's decision to call off the search. Although the British continued to be in full control of the search, and the Americans also deployed an own aircraft, it was now predominantly a national, namely a German search. On December 20th, the head of Hapag-Lloyd's nautical department, Captain von Madel, arrived with several colleagues at the Navy's Fleet Command in Glucksburg. After clarifying the details of a close cooperation, 2 navigators and a radio specialist from the shipping company remained in Glucksburg to support the naval personnel in charge. From now on, the trustful joint operation considerably helped to coordinate all aircraft, at least with the 8 ships from Hapag-Lloyd that took part in the search. Furthermore, after intensive endeavors, the Navy specialists succeeded, for the first time, to establish direct contact with the merchant ships, using the Fleet Command's powerful military radio communication facility. Before then, aircraft and merchant vessels had no means to communicate with each other, and countless lives were lost at sea due to that shortcoming. However, the search for survivors remained unsuccessful, much to the regret of everyone. And so, on the second day of the prolonged search, the federal government decided, in consultation with the shipping company and the Navy's Fleet Command, to finally terminate the operation at sundown on December 22nd. The search for the München lasted 10 days and nights. It had been performed by 80 to 110 merchant vessels and 13 aircraft under extremely adverse weather conditions. Still considered the largest search and rescue operation in maritime history, it covered 1.7 million square kilometers, an area that stretched around 5 times the size of today's Federal Republic of Germany. But what's even more impressive lies hidden behind these cold figures. The search for the München not only demonstrated again the truly remarkable solidarity and dedication of seafarers, but also an unparalleled comradeship between seafarers and military aviators, all of whom pushed themselves to the limits of their physical and mental capabilities. Some of them even incurred risks beyond all reason, simply for the honorable purpose of saving the souls of their fellow seafarers. The deployed patrol and transport aircraft spent a total of 750 hours airborne, 500 hours of which were performed by the German MPAs alone in 38 sorties. Under most adverse environmental conditions, the German Naval Air Wing 3 had shown what it was capable of. Of all aircraft of the four nations involved, the German MPAs alone had successful sightings of cargo barges and other flotsam from the München sinking. The German Luftwaffe rendered invaluable support by carrying a great deal of required material and personnel from Germany to the Azores Islands. Without their assistance, the Navy's patrol aircraft had certainly not conducted their missions so effectively. The Royal Air Force was the first sending an aircraft to the designated search area, and later deployed another one. They had operated almost at the western boundary of their area of responsibility. The U.S. Air Force and the Portuguese Navy had also joined search efforts with one aircraft each. Their contribution has not yet been given the consideration it deserves. After all, it was nothing short of a miracle that no accident occurred and no more human lives, other than the victims of the München tragedy, were lost.
There we reach the end of part 1 of our documentary. Stay tuned for the second part coming soon here on this channel. Please let us know your comments and don't forget to give us a like. Thank you so much for your interest.